Where does wisdom come from, and how do we open ourselves up to it? Today's podcast guest, Dr. Patrick Reyes, makes a strong case that wisdom comes from the teachers in our lives, particularly the generations who have come before us, those we find ourselves in community with, or even the people we're networked with in work or otherwise. In today's world, it's tempting to think that we have to be the problem solvers and fixers. But what do we do when we don't know the answers or aren't the best person for the job? Today's conversation is about how to be more human, feel more connected, resist the temptation to know everything, and to gather around the table, all with the expectation that those spaces and people are some of the wisest teachers we have access to. I'm really excited for you to hear from Patrick on this topic. Patrick, it's so good to have you on the podcast.
I'm grateful to be here.
How are you?
I'm doing so good. It's finally spring. The hummingbirds are back. So I am happy. I'm in my happy spot.
Hummingbird spring. Yeah, I think you might know that a couple years ago, my husband and 2 kids and I, we moved from Los Angeles to the Midwest. And in LA, you didn't get those same rhythms of the birds are coming and the flowers are about. So now spring means something totally different to me than it used to. The theme, okay, so let me just give you the overview of the entire podcast, and then we'll jump into questions here. This podcast is really birthed out of some data that we did, a research project we did at the Dupree Center, where we were asking questions about what does it mean to be healthy in leadership? What does it mean to be faithful in leadership? What does it mean to be fruitful in leadership? And we got this really incredible picture of, okay, people lean into really difficult times. They seek the best for others. They don't try to go at things alone. And over, we heard stories that that kind of work wasn't always spotlight work. It was sort of behind the scenes work. And so that's where this whole idea of the hidden work of leadership was birthed. And this season in particular, we're getting after the question, or the idea of the hidden work of leadership when wisdom is needed, right? I mean, the world is in need of wisdom. At the Dupree Center, we are honestly really convinced and even convicted that the world needs more good leaders. And we think that the story of faith offers a framework and guideposts for that. And that comes down to not just knowing the things, but being able to show up as wise people and wise people together. So that's why we're narrowing in on wisdom. And so I want to start with you. Everybody's got different definitions, different frameworks, different sources. So what do you think wisdom is, and where do you think it comes from?
Yeah, wisdom for me. I think, thank you for the introduction and the reminder that there's so many different entry points into this conversation. And for mine has always been in my own Chicano indigenous roots. Born and raised in California, and thinking about wisdom that is in those roots that are passed on for generations. The ancestral and communal knowledges that are passed on
Yeah.
from generation to generation that don't just help us survive whatever moment we're in, but really thrive to find the rhythms and love of our community, of our people, to help us in these moments. So wisdom for me is it comes from.
You said something there that actually I know is in your first book. Your first book is Nobody Cries When We Die, right? There's not a previous book before that I'm missing. Okay. Um, and one of the most striking pieces of that book to me is this reframing of the entire idea of vocation or God's calling from, in sort of privileged Western, sometimes white circles. We think about calling as this idea of getting to do all the things that we were meant to do. But you just touched on it there in your language of moving from survival to thriving. So I'm going to ask you just to unpack what you mean by that and the sort of a broader call before we move on to another question.
Yeah, so I've a Christian, like drawing on my own Christian roots and traditions. One of the ways I've been talking about this is there's a reason why it in at least one of the it starts with the lineage,
Ah.
the generations of change. There's a reason why when Jesus is walking with his disciples and trying to discern what comes next, Jesus goes and talks with Moses and Elijah. Those are ancestors that he's having this conversation with. And in my book, I
Mhm.
talk about this, like drawing on the wisdom of our people and our traditions. And for me, that's a deeply Christian thing, that we have these texts and traditions that are thousands of years old, that are steeped in wisdom, and me trying to really marry those two, the the lineages that I have inherited in my blood and the wisdom and that I've inherited from this, what I think is a beautiful tradition, with and seeing ourselves as descendants of that tradition, and finding ways to put those, that love of both, together to help us to our next steps,
Mm.
or sometimes not even next steps, just what we're doing to this today. The love we're trying to put into the world today. Um, that I think that comes from those places. It comes from the deep wisdom of our ancestors, and it comes from the deep wisdom of that we find in our texts and our traditions.
What Okay, I'm gonna throw out just a comment, and you can say if you think this is too far stretching. I'll speak very, like, autobiographically here. As a white woman born in the Midwest, someone who's had access to higher education and had the privilege of that, I would take a look at my people in the most broadest sense and say, I don't know that we're living as descendants. I don't know, like, have we lost our way a little bit? And so when you look out in a broader culture, when you look out and sort of notice what's happening, do you think we're as in touch as we could be with that relationship?
Yeah, this question comes up a lot, and I feel like deep pain that we aren't more connected to our lineages. I think that's a great, this the shadow side of our current society or culture around individualization and, consumers and that sort of thing, that the and even the conversations that we've had around leadership or vocation about being, this is about me. So what am
Mhm.
I going to do? What am I going to do with this one precious life? And I think that there's, to quote Mary Oliver, there's a invitation for us to do some deeper work about what does it mean to be a good ancestor? What does it mean to be a descendant? I think is tied to what does it mean to be a good ancestor, and reconnect to those. So you doing the hard work of learning our lineages and learning where those folks come from, knowing that for so many people in the U.S., Black, Indigenous communities in particular, those history, and it's hard. That's
Yeah.
hard work to do, to try to recover those pieces and put them together, because the way we've been disconnected, and I think in
Mm.
cultures that are, um, uh, um, I'm thinking of the even just the way that you frame the question. I mean, for me, growing up in California, how um, painful that was to get a Western history that was U.S. went from the East Coast to the West Coast, sea to
Right.
shining sea, and being a Latino with indigenous roots in California, Spanish arrived and went north. There's a different history of the land that could be told very differently, of the history of colonization. And I learned that history. I learned the East to West history. I learned the stories of, the recently arrived of the folks who came over, searching for a better life, learned, the not perfect version of the Mayflower, that that is probably,
Mhm.
the first step in colonization, not the first journey of someone who discovers anything. So, like, that sort of
Sure.
pain for me around, that I feel is a collective pain, collective trauma of erasing how we talk about our own histories, our own lineages, actually a barrier for us finding a wisdom where we can actually live together in a bit in more harmony, because these histories, these traditions, these lineages that we draw on, if we don't know them, we can't know a better future.
Yeah.
We don't know what we're healing from. We don't know what traumas that we're carrying in our bodies, and I think this plays out in our leadership every day. That, the things that we're up against, if we're not really empathizing or understanding that people are navigating different generational gifts, wisdoms, traumas, we miss the deeper histories, the deeper truths of that person when we're engaging them. So, yeah, I think for me that question just it poses. I think we are disconnected, and some of the best healing work that I'm a part of in my leadership circles is reconnecting people with their
Mm.
deeper past, so that way we can imagine a better future.
Mm. Reconnecting people with their deeper past so that together we can imagine a better future. That's powerful. And as I, track with your work and follow along, that feels really reflective of what I've observed. So thank you for offering that. Thanks for just naming that. I think it takes me to my next question. And even so, your second book, The Purpose Gap, which is just a really helpful look at, why some folks are set up to, again, be able to explore this sense of vocation and calling and purpose, and how you just do a good job of sort of describing why there's gaps in particular communities and what it looks like to close those. And rooted in that, and the answer that you just gave about getting in touch with our role as descendants, I want to quote you to you. You write, and that I know, scary. It was like, where's this going?
But what I say,
You write to what did I say? No, false. You write, today the right conditions are necessary for great teachers to appear. And when I read that, the heart of a teacher is open, right? Is passing on story. I would say that's the heart of what leadership needs in this era as well. So you go on to say that we're infatuated. You can describe who the "were" is if you want, but we're infatuated with this lone warrior myth, this the kind of Mary Oliver quote that you talked about. There's something that's very romantic and on some level appeals to something deep inside of us, but that in the midst of complex change, it's less about having the fittest and sort of most special person emerge, and more about something else. Can you tell us why you think the time is right for great teachers to appear, and what that means in contradiction to this lone warrior myth?
yeah, I mean, I think the great teachers appearing, or what that means for me, is that I'm the beneficiary of some amazing teachers, and it's tied to that the second part of your question, which is how I typically introduce myself. I sit between five generations of Carmelitas. Five generations
Mm.
back, there was a Carmelita, my grandmother, who I read about a lot. Basically saved my life. Was a Carmelita. My daughter's name is Carmelita. In five generations, there will be a Carmelita, and so when I think about that generational outlook, there's a little Patrick in between all of that. So what does that mean? That, five generations from now, that Carmelita probably won't be reading my book world. But what I'm the beneficiary of is that Carmelita five generations back was dreaming and imagining a world for me, for the sense to be
Mm.
loved and to have the opportunities that I've had. And if I can do that sort of passing on of that love that I'm the beneficiary of, that five generations from Carmelita will benefit it in ways that I could never even imagine. Living in a world I can't really imagine. So that for me, those great teachers are those who are around us in our communities that are lifting us up, that are speaking love and wisdom over our lives. The 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 I think that just because we're talking about wisdom and that question about teachers, my work is so I say education, I say teaching, I say learning a lot in the book, and I actually don't use the word wisdom all that much. And part of the reason why is, I want to recover my grandma who didn't
Mm.
education as an educator, as a teacher, someone who was actually teaching me that what we were learning in our community had cultural knowledge and wisdom in ways that should have been honored and um, paid for. Like that these
Mhm.
are the elders who are keeping our communal stories alive. The language is a great example of this. Like that's passed on from generation to generation, not just learned in school. And we see what happens when we don't invest in that. It's lost. In my community, indigenous languages are going extinct, and that's
Mm.
heartbreaking. So the idea that those folks are teachers, and my hope is that we recognize them as such and not kind of put them in a category of like, oh, that's not real education. That's over here, or that's cultural education. And I was trying to say, oh no, these are our teachers. These are real,
Mhm.
just as real as you and I are teachers in formal academic settings. They are teachers in our communities, and they should be honored and valued as such. And so that's kind of where that hopeful recovery of what we do as educators looks like and to see them in more than just the classroom.
Hmm. Yeah, it's helpful. As you were talking, just my own mind, and I don't know if this is true for listeners, my own mind drifted to the faces of the people who have taught me the things that I hold most dear. And those include formal teachers in formal settings. Um, but the person who, so I have a daughter named Evelyn, who's named after my grandmother, who is Evelyn, because when I think about the good life, right? And that's sort of a theological term, but it's also literally the state motto of the state I live in. Like, what is a good life? What does that mean? What does that look like? It's it's her wisdom and her time that taught me what it meant. And that was such an embodied knowing that I think what I hear you saying, or at least what I'm saying, what I'm gathering in reflection is it also is we have to make space to sort of extract the wisdom that's been deposited in us or live into it or bring it up to the surface, to name it, to catalog it so that we very intentionally continue to pass it along, correct?
100%. I mean, just think about the some of the stuff that I think is gonna be even more with the change in technology right now, to think about leadership, the gift of cooking, for example, that I'm inheriting my grandma's recipes, and I'm sure your listeners have those kind of family recipes that have been passed on, so, we still have some of the cards, and then some that we just know in our hands and our bodies, but talk a lot about, what does it mean to make tortilla dough and how to do that well, or nopales, like, these are, and the stories that came along teaching us how to make food for each other in love. And that process was more than just here's a recipe, here's how you get it. And definitely not, here's your DoorDash order, have it delivered to your
Right.
front door. It was the lessons she was teaching me while she was doing that. Like, here's an alchemist who is teaching me why
Uh-huh.
you mix these things together at certain times. This is why you need the dough for so long, because this change is happening in the dough. So you have this master in the kitchen who's not just
Mhm.
making a thing, but like doing science right there in front of me. Then asking me questions as she's doing that. Like, Mijo, tell me about your day. Tell me about
Mhm.
who are your friends. Tell me about what you're learning in school. No, I got a master pastor who's like doing
Right.
deep empathetic youth ministry in the kitchen at this same time, and then feeding and listening and delighting in the the whole family who's benefiting from this meal, while and hearing all the messiness and being able to hold it. That's a facilitator. That's a leader who's like able to kind of build the container. I'm thinking about all the facilitation language: build the container, hold the
Mhm.
container, love the container,
Mhm.
allow it to release the container, invite people into leadership. Like, inviting people in to do dishes, actually, that's that's a
Mhm.
deep leadership skill because no one wants to do it. So there's these like ways of reframing these moments that we all have in our daily lives, that we can say, oh, we can absolutely see these things as education, these moments as deep education that's being passed on from generation to generation. And like, this is the vision of a healed world that I'm hoping we get to. When I'm sharing those cultural stories and traditions, and invite you to my house, and we're eating tortillas, and you bring what comes from your people and your histories and your traditions, and you feel like that's the vision of the kingdom of God that I'm going for. Like that sort of potluck, that is what that's what I'm hoping for, in leadership, and trying to make that formal, to say there's plenty of research and evidence here that says that is leadership, that 100% is a type of education, and that
Yeah.
it needs to be recovered and centered.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. I also when I hear you describe that, I the w the constraint and the sort of thing that is pushing in my mind is this idea of, like, time and pace and this collective work to determine a pace that prioritizes, like, the slow movements that give the pathways to all of the um, sometimes informal, but ought to be formalized and centered and recovered aspects of education. You've used a metaphor. I've quoted you a lot. This is one of the things I quote you on the most, which is, I think, somewhat connected to this. And I also quote a song from Encanto at the same time. So
I
that
love it.
speaks to my like having small children. But it's this idea of stars versus constellations.
Yeah.
And I think there is so much of the work world, there is so much of life that is pushing individuals, particularly smart, capable individuals, to have to be adept problem solvers, to have to be the ones that have the answers, even in unknown situations. And over and over again is asking individuals to sort of carry loads on their shoulders that are probably just too large for
Yep.
people to carry. And so your image of stars and constellations, I think, offers a reframe to that. So I would love for you to just unpack that and talk about why you think it's important in light of the conversation we've been having.
Yeah, that phrase, I mean, comes out of one of the chapter titles. And just to say where that came from, because you got leaders on here, we had a bunch of deans and presidents come. We've been working on an initiative in higher education for years, years and years and years about transforming change, that sort of thing in their institutions. And, it's the usual type of coming together. There was some research projects. There was a hotel ballroom usually where we'd hear a keynoter say, here's the solutions for all your problems. And then we would all go back to our offices and do exactly what we always did. Like just the email chain came up. And so I said, we need to break this cycle. And we ended up
Mm.
going to Yosemite and yeah, with these folks, and it just happened to be one of those times in California. There was a fire, no electricity. The drive-in from Fresno, when they got to the top of the hill, was snowing. By the time they got back down, the next day it was like 70 degrees. The park was evacuated. So you had these deans and presidents who I brought to this national park on indigenous lands to think through and have perspective. And all the modern day technologies were gone. They couldn't email. They were all preserving their phones. They turned them off because they wanted to have their batteries for a few days later. And we are just stuck in this
Mm.
in the park. And we would go out each night and we'd look up at the stars and against the backdrop of the big granite walls and all that stuff. It was perspective. I mean, it really provided so much perspective for these leaders that the relationships, the evaluations that came back from that are still some of the best reflections I've ever had about being close to God around, oh, when I wasn't trying to answer the urgency of my email box or, trying to solve this budgetary crisis and actually spent time doubling down on the relationships that I had, I could see myself as part of a bigger world, bigger universe, just because of the natural environment, but also my work across institutions got strengthened. I can't do this alone. I needed all of these other folks around me. And so seeing that we, when you're in a place that's got no light, where I am in Santa Fe, we have this almost every night. You have a sky full of stars. And I think our system is just so set up to say, I want to be the star. I
Yeah.
want to be the brightest shining star. And the invitation for us to say, like, if you are in a place where you see, like we were with those deans and presidents, or where I live in New Mexico, where you see a constellation every single night, that far is more overwhelming, more awe-inspiring than any single one that's shining bright. In fact, like, the joke in the book is the sun. You just stare at the sun when it's out in the day, it'll burn your
Right.
retinas. Like, that it's not a good leadership model in general. And the invitation for what that means on the day to day was that we should be cultivating communities of care. And this is hard. I mean, I know my own work. Um, there's so much that I can do, should do, want to do that it's um, for someone who's got a strong work ethic like me. Of course, I'm in every meeting. My calendar's packed. I'm trying to do the budget, trying to do programs, trying to do everything. And at the same time, relying on my colleagues and asking for support and learning that a part of being part of that constellation means that "Oh, I really got to hold myself in balance here. That the point is not to shine brighter in any of these, be a part of this constellation." And um, that's not to one up, not to, hold back, but to actually just shine how I shine in the midst of these folks and be okay with that. And that's for those who are called to leadership. Sometimes that is a different type of calling you need to be listening for. It's like, is the culture right? Is the institution right? Am I
Mm,
setting the table in the right way? Am I talking too much? Am I talking too less? Or do I need to talk less? That sort of reframe on what leadership means it takes a lot of work, a lot of humility to say, I'm going to be okay with being a part of this constellation.
mm, mm. Yeah, I heard in there, sort of self-regulation, like kind of self-awareness, the kind of regulation that comes from awareness. I heard, um, non-defensiveness, right? I heard, sort of leaning away from competitive mindsets that just sort of like happens and you want to be, and there's only this sort of, we would call it scarcity mindset where all of a sudden somebody on your team becomes your competitor. I think I also heard, or at least maybe I inferred, a sense of giving credit, like, away, like, sharing not sort of hogging on to credit, and then I think, but I wanna check this last one, I think I also heard, uh, developing a capacity of what to say yes and no to. Is that last one, did I hear that in there? And how
Oh,
does the yes
100%.
and no, how does that apply?
Well, one, the whole list you just gave, I violate all that list. That's to say this is
Sure.
constant work.
Yeah,
Like this is
100%.
there's like, there's a way of being, but I think that yes and no for me has been really hard as someone coming from Salinas, California. It's, less than 1% of 1% have a degree in any field. That being in spaces where you receive an invitation and having a strong work ethic, of course, I want to say yes to everything. There is no, but there's the way I've been reframing it's, being very selective about what we say yes to in prioritization. So like, yes, in my relationship to God, yes, in my relationship to my family, yes, in my relationship to my colleagues and coworkers and community, and the way I'm living into my ancestors. And if I have to say no, maybe it's a not right now. But
Mhm, mhm.
there's an invitation that or referral, like really, really great leaders refer, you know?
Yeah,
That sounds like a
yeah.
great question. I haven't thought about that. Here's who on my team. Here's who in my community could really be a great resource for you. And this is some of the work that we've been doing in Auburn around leadership development has been thinking about this. Like our work is faithful leadership development. We're not the only place. I mean, I was thinking about just the executive leadership turnover presentation we did a couple weeks ago. I mean, your resources were one of the ones we mentioned at the end, saying like, "Hey, if you're trying to go deep on this piece around spirituality and leadership, you should go to the Dupree Center. Like that is where you'll find all these resources. Don't ask us for them. We don't have those types of resources. You do. So just kind of the being able to have the ability to refer and the humility when the temptation is so strong, especially for men, to
Mm, mhm.
to be invited in to have expertise in something they don't necessarily have expertise and to say, "Actually, I know someone. I
Uh-huh.
know of some resources. Actually, let me make a connection," or the the "I don't know. I actually don't have any good answers for you. I simply don't know. But I'm here to help you figure that out if you want."
Mm.
Yes and no, a little nuance on the no part. Yeah.
Yeah, I would maybe add in there too, the one that I've had to really grow in, and it's been such a delight to grow in it, even if the muscles, like you go to the gym, you haven't been in a while, you're like, woo, this is hard, does not feel good. But eventually it feels like, oh, this feels good. Is that I don't know one in the referring, but also like, oh, there's a temptation to hoard opportunity. And you think, "Oh, it might not come around again," or, "Oh, I can do this," and to just say, "I think somebody else actually like, should do that," and in that way, the constellation actually gets a little brighter, right?
Yep.
And you're like, "Oh," and then at some point, that light, like, helps you in ways that you don't foresee. And so just this capacity to be generative. Okay, so I'm thinking about people who find themselves in structural leadership, people who think, okay, this is great, but I have no agency at work. People who think this is great, but like, nobody on my team thinks in these generational terms, or wow, I've never thought before in these generational terms. All right. I'm just thinking about the variety of types of people who might be listening. One of the very practical ways I've heard you help map this is networks versus community. So help us map that. How do networks and community fit into all that we've talked about ancestors, we talked about constellations, talked about how that plays into structural leadership and temptations. How do those two categories fit in here?
Yeah, what I love about the network, or at least the research I was doing for the purpose gap around networks, is networks are time bound. That there are some real limitations on what networks can, and that's not a bad thing. So I think about leadership too. Like our leadership is time bound. I will not be in this, you know, confidently. Because like at
Right.
the very least, we're gonna die, and I know what the data is on about how long people last in jobs, and that shouldn't be a threat to the institution. It shouldn't be a threat to my own ego. Like these are just facts. All these jobs are temporary because that's the nature of the work. And networks, similarly, are for me a connection of resources, people, time that are held together for the moment that the people, as long as the people are willing to commit to those relationships. And I say that in building those types of networks, it requires people to provide effort. I mean, this is anyone who's in leadership who's tried to do partnerships before, partnership work across institutions. Because you have the internal dynamics, of course, of amongst your team, but then once you start introducing people to other teams, other institutions who are in similar fields, or you're trying to do similar projects, it almost contentious. Like the competitiveness, like why are we sharing information? Why are we doing this work together? What about us? Are we not going to be they're not going to see our logo enough. That was a conversation I had last week. Like our logos is not as big as theirs
Mm,
on the website. It's like,
mm,
oh, I
mm,
mean, when you die, are you going to say that? Remember that time my logo wasn't as big on the website? So like the idea that you have to commit to those types of relationships, know that there's probably going to be conflict, because while there might be value aligned, mission alignment, the how we go about our work is going to be very different, not just because of our institutional context, but because of our cultural context. And for me, I'm saying that that's actually a worthwhile investment in networks, because what we're trying to do is build ecosystems or of support of imagination. My work is in in the humanities, in the cultivation of the human experience, love and thriving of future generations. So that means everyone who's working on these issues, I need you to be amazing. Your institution, I need you to thrive. I need your institution to be doing the best leadership development work that you can possibly do. And I will do everything in my power to make sure that happens. Because if you are thriving, if your institution is thriving, the folks are being met. I'll give you a brief story about how this sounds in practice. We do leadership development with young adults, emerging young adults, and we're sitting in a circle, and there's another organization that works in a similar space as ours. And we had a participant say in circle, "Thank you, Patrick, for this experience. It's so much better than this other
mm,
place I went to for 4 years and was doing this experience." And so I said, "Hold on, I'm going to
mm,
stop you." Like, as this is in
mm,
circle, I said, I hear you. And of course I love that comment. And I want to reframe what you're saying to say that you had 4 years of leadership experience that other people in this circle may have not had access. Can you tell me all the things you got out of that
mm,
experience? Because someone in this circle might actually benefit from what you have already received. And we're not, because we're not in competition with them. We see this as a value add for you to be a part of both.
mm,
Can you share what it is? And they shared, and they they came up at lunch to go, "Oh my gosh, I never thought about it that way." Like, I really thought I was trying to find something better, as opposed to like, I am trying to find ways to connect people to the experiences and resources that they actually need the moment they need them. So that's how I think
mm.
about networks. Networks are those connecting nodes that allow us to get access to the people, the resources, the opportunities that we need at the right time. And for those in leadership, it takes work. It takes the challenge of being able to commit the time and to think about bridging divides when they it's not there's not a lot of incentive internally to do that, to bridge, and yet we know our leaders will be better if they're more resourced, more equipped,
Mm,
better supported across at the time that they need it, and having the humility to say, "May Patrick Reyes at Auburn, am only going to have this much influence on this person. I know they'll be better if they have access to more resources from other institutions that offer something different."
yeah, yeah. That's in every single thing that you've said today, the wisdom that I hear coming through that I think is desperately needed. And it's one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of your work and have students read your books and am quoting you all the time is you have this situational awareness of where you sit in relationship to other people. And you described it in your family sitting in between, in the midst of 5 generations of Carmelitas. You describe it in the networks and in the work of leadership. The demand list is so high, the challenges are becoming increasingly complex that it's ominous to imagine a future in which our instincts take us more into isolation. And so the beauty and I mean, I'll use the word liberation of what you're describing here is that we're not alone and that we are loved and that we have clear and open pathways to the people in our community, the people of our teachers of deepest formation, those we sit and network with, those we work in structural leadership with, those who we might just pass by in a group experience one time. And so that is really striking. And I just want to thank you for walking through the world that way and sharing that wisdom with us.
I appreciate that.
Okay, last question. Where can people find out more about you? You've mentioned a little bit about Auburn. You've got a couple books. Is there a place that you want to point people to?
Yeah, so the main place would be go to auburnseminary.org. You can see all of our leadership curriculum, our storytelling work, our research is up there. People can also find me at patrickbreyes.com. So that, I got all my stuff up there. And, one of the biggest places I would say to find me is in the spirit of my work is in backyard barbecues, in kitchens, anywhere people are convening other folks and saying, "I love you." That's where I wanna be. So, in this, I think to your last point, the deepest encouragement I have for folks is these skills, this education of gathering people in a world of AI, a world of
Mhm.
individualization. I think that's gonna be the demand of leadership is who's able to actually hold community, who's able to love community, and I, commend you. I'm a fan of your work and the ways that leadership, and I think it's going to set up the world for a better place, and it's at least what I'm experiencing right now.
Well, thank you very much for your work and for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the hidden work of leadership. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and found it insightful. The Hidden Work of Leadership is brought to you by the Max Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary, where we envision a world in which leaders across industries and seasons of life are deeply formed as the people of God so that they might seek the very best for the people and systems entrusted to their care. Our episodes are produced by Justin Heap, who ensures our engineering and editing is engaging and sounds just right. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on your favorite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. You can also follow the Dupree Center on LinkedIn and Instagram for updates and behind-the-scenes content. For more information about today's episode and access to additional resources, visit our website at dupree.org. That's DEPREE.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Hidden Work of Leadership.